Hi, I'm Jacob Chambers, and I am covering the intro and conclusion of Music on the Move. Music is everywhere. We pick our music based on our mood and surroundings. Your music taste often decides your social group in some cases. People can encounter different kinds of music from different kinds of places, depending on how often they come in contact with people of other cultures. They can also access different national music depending on their access to media. K-pop and reggae, for example. We understand how music is shared and of the network that it operates in. We realize that music is an action, not an object. That network is globalization, a constantly changing network of ideas involving music and culture that is distributed internationally. This has many benefits, as it is the reason why we have access to music we would not have heard otherwise in other parts of the world. Globalization is not all positive, however. It can have a disrupting effect on certain cultures. Due to the constant blending of musical ideas present in globalization, it can lead to several misunderstandings of certain cultures and their beliefs. The system through which music is transmitted internationally is unstable. Some music makes it to the club easily, while other music never makes it past the bouncer. You need to be very careful drawing boundaries around musical ideas. Any sort of inaccuracy can lead to the use of stereotypes. Conclusion. American sociologist Philip Reeve believes cultures should have clear boundaries so they can instill social norms within its organization to prevent disorganizing concepts or ideas, mainly involving race, gender, and immigration. The ways people view each other have changed because of globalization and how it has seeped into the media transported internationally, namely music and television. On the bright side, some activists are able to use this media to spread awareness of social causes and human rights issues. On the dark side, globalization and its rules are unevenly distributed. Certain groups will attack minority groups because they feel threatened by their supposedly disruptive presence due to the lack of true understanding behind globalization. Regarding the rules of culture, Reeve created two models. Model 1 shows a vertical scale. It's very traditional, and it shows the top being better than the bottom, and there is a clear hierarchy in place. Model 2 shows a horizontal scale. It claims that every idea is of equal value. Reeve seemed to be a bigger fan of his first model, claiming that cultures without hierarchies are lawless, and this leads to chaos. Anthropologist Arjun Appadurai seems to be a bigger fan of the second model, proposing a compromise where the second model is put in place in society, with very clear and unquestionable rules and regulations, securing rights for all people and widely distributed media. Fellow anthropologist Nestor Garcia Canclini concurs with the idea of some cultural mixing, but grows concerned over the possibility of weaker cultures submitting to the ideas of larger cultures, thus losing some of their heritage forever. Canclini is especially suspicious of market forces, urging artists to know the difference between the tokenism they present and the genuine desire to understand and blend cultures. According to Canclini, mixing is only good if the artists choose it. Although artistic mixing can cause as much harm as it can good, and it doesn't solve all our problems, it can help us imagine what is possible, like all great art can. Musical mixing can bring in further opportunities for inclusion. Through music, people otherwise not akin to each other can discover what unites them, and they can find new ways to relate to each other.
So chapter 4 is called Sound Recording and Mediation of Music. This chapter starts out by explaining what mediation is and how it works. Mediation is essentially anything that comes between the creator or the author of a work and the people or person listening to that work. Mediation can be a variety of things, from recording medium to the actual people performing the music itself, to what the chapter eventually starts going more in depth on, which is actually cultural standing and the way the audio is actually edited together. So as kind of a summary, because it goes pretty in depth in the book, essentially the recording industry got together and they decided that they were going to market the music of colonized cultures as world music. And so recording engineers from richer countries traveled to smaller, less fortunate countries, and they organized some of the more trained singers or the more professional musicians from that culture, and they would record them and then profit off of that because people from other cultures found that music interesting and they made quite a bit of money off of it. Another huge form of mediation is editing, especially when tape was invented and the way that you could cut together magnetic tape that sound was recorded on. A lot of people didn't like this when it came out because they thought it sounded unnatural because you couldn't achieve that result just playing on one's own. And then into chapter 5, which is entitled Music and Media in Service of the State. So chapter 5 is mostly about music and its political uses. The chapter begins with an explanation of what a state/nation and what nationalism are and what propaganda is. And then it kind of goes into a little bit of early history. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of Middle Eastern and Asian countries began adopting what they called modern culture and music style, which in truth is just Western European and American culture and music style, which is kind of a testament to the way that Europe kind of shaped the way the rest of the world thought about their culture and their tradition. Europe and the way its music is created the standard for the way that the modern world thinks of music, and that it provided a lot of the scales that modern music uses, and it provided what we call 12-tone equal temperament, which is the way the frequencies relate to each other, but that's completely beside the point. Anyway, as Western culture, as Europe won wars or conquered new colonial territory, it would inject its culture into this country, and that country would essentially modernize and adopt European culture. For some of the Middle Eastern and Asian countries, specifically Turkey and China, this didn't happen for a long time because of communist rule. Also the USSR. There was a big kind of musical fight during the Cold War because each side of the Cold War's music so strongly represented the nationalism that the side of the war represented. After the war was over, they got together and they shared musicians, and they came up with a whole bunch of new ideas about how to do music, but that's completely different. What happened in China was obviously a communist nation, and eventually it started to let in some music that was not necessarily anti-government, which previously hadn't been allowed. It was just pro-government music and media. But it started to allow in new music which wasn't directly political, but had very political undertones that kind of wanted something different. This all really came to a head in 1989 at the Tiananmen Square massacre, when a bunch of college students and other protesters got sick of the Chinese government, protested, and got essentially massacred. They were killed, they were shot, they were beat to death. And then nations started to adopt this idea that they needed to be multicultural in their representation of music and different cultures and everything, which unfortunately actually also resulted in a misrepresentation of culture, kind of like the invented tradition that the early recording industry accidentally presented in its attempt to create world music.
So up next, I'm going to be talking about chapters 6 and 7, starting with chapter 6. Chapter 6 is about composing the mediated self. And there is a lot that went into this that I found super interesting, such as the different forms of mediation, one of those being the flattered self, and liking like the sheer flattery of everything, and that's why people do what they do. But I believe that the biggest part of chapter 6 is often one that'll be overlooked, and one that is often not going to be talked about because of people afraid of how others will react to it. But that is the topic of how they touched on the cultural appropriation. And I think that's a very big deal, especially in things like music, because there's oftentimes you see people stealing from others, especially other cultures and heritages that just aren't theirs, and it's not fair when they blow up and they're not getting credit back to the original artists and cultures and heritages. And I thought it was interesting about how it said how globally we are all losing our cultural authenticity. But instead we should just blend that together and giving up neither identity for the others, so we can still keep who we are individually, but still combine everything else that we have learned and grown to adapt to. And then moving on to chapter 7, that is over copyright, surveillance, and the ownership of music. And I believe the most important part of this chapter that we really need to be able to take away from is what copyright is, what all these things are, and how they work. So copyright is when record companies also own the intangible rights, legal rights to reproduce, publish, sell, or distribute any of the context that they please. And that's basically them making money off of other people not being able to use the music. And the monetization that they put on it is how they are actually gaining money from that. So if you watch it on YouTube or you watch it on TV, they're gaining money from that because of the monetization they have. But another important one I think that I didn't really know much about until this was intellectual properties, which is the legal right to reproduce. And then there's other things that are touched on, and one of the other things I want to talk about before my time is up is Brazil and how they went to Creative Commons licensing, which is basically the artist gets to choose, not the record company, not anyone else, but the artist gets to choose how they want to go across with their copyright and their monetization. And I just found that extremely interesting how they're doing that. I believe that is something that should be adapted in other places. But that will be my quick 3-minute summary of chapters 6 and 7.